The gospel according to John is always a little defensive about John the Baptist. Even the rhythm of the deeply poetic prologue to the gospel, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, is broken up in that prologue to point out that John the Baptist was not the light, but only came to bear witness to the light. The section that was then taken out of that prologue and put in the front of our lesson today from the gospel. John specifically in that lesson denies that he's the Messiah, or that he's Elijah, or even a prophet. And that's because there were at the time the gospel was written, people who believed that he was a prophet, that he was in fact Elijah. And there were also some people that believed that John the Baptist himself was the Messiah. Those understandings continue down to our own day. John the Baptist is considered to be a very important prophet in the religion of Islam. And there are still around 60,000 adherents in the world of a religion called Mandaism who consider John the Baptist to be the Messiah. There may be fewer than that now because that community was greatly disrupted by the Iraq War and the Syrian wars. Last week we read from Mark that John wore camel's hair and had a leather belt around his waist, which was sort of a prophetic uniform, and that he ate locusts and wild honey, which was known to be a prophetic diet. Those were mentioned in order to point out his position as a prophet. Also, in spite of denying his role as a prophet, the fourth gospel associates him with the fulfillment of a prophecy found in Isaiah. And beyond his work of baptism for the remission of sins, he is said to be a messenger, pointing to the one coming after him, which is a prophetic kind of action. The confusion around that may come from the changing understanding of what prophecy is all about. Colloquially, we think of a prophet as a predictor of the future, as a seeing the future, telling about the future. And that was probably the understanding of what prophecy was at the time of Jesus. But that was not its original meaning. Prophets were truth tellers, not fortune tellers. They were less like the horoscope in the newspaper and more like the editorial page. They looked at a situation and could see how things stood. And from that, they could sense the flow of events and point out the probabilities if things went the way they were already going. Sometimes they were warning people, sometimes chastising people, sometimes, like the Isaiah section that we had for today's reading, they were comforting people. But in all those cases, they told the truth. Prophecy is telling the truth. And of course, there's been a lot of talk about truth these past few years. Rudy Giuliani said, "What is truth?" But Pontius Pilate had said that before him. The late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan is often quoted uncited as saying, "Everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not to his own facts." Objective facts are best understood, however, through the scientific method, and they have a fairly narrow range of that objectivity. They are mostly useful in exerting some kind of influence, some kind of control over the external environment. If you're working on a vaccine, I suppose it's the internal environment as well. But you can't really prove everything by facts. They get amassed and put together in various ways, sometimes misunderstood. It may be a fact that it's 80 degrees outside, as measured by a thermometer at the Monterey airport. But whether you think it's hot or not depends on something else. It's relative to the average temperature. It's relative to a person's percentage of body fat. I'm often hot. It's relative to their gender and their level of stress, relative to where they grew up. It's even relative to what temperature they think it is. It depends on the context. Even the fact that it's 80 degrees arises because of its connection to the reasons you're even measuring it. And that reason itself is relative to your context, to the story that you tell yourself about comfort, about weather. So our experience, even our experience of what we understand as factual reality, is shaped by the stories that we tell ourselves. There was a comment posted on the website next door about the beautiful sunset someone said they saw from the beach at Carmel a few nights ago. Did you happen to see that sunset? Not factually. The sun doesn't set. The earth rotates. The fool on the hill sees the sun going down, and the eyes in his head see the world spinning around. You only know what you think you know. You only know what you need to know. And what you think you know depends on why you're trying to know it. Facts are only useful as they are applied, and sometimes they're sufficient and sometimes they aren't. You can fly from New York to Paris using only the theories of Sir Isaac Newton, and you'll be just fine. But if you're interested in space travel, you'll need to bring in Einstein, maybe even quantum physics. It's all relative. Einstein said even gravity is relative. The truth is relative. The idea of the relativity of truth was the primary focus of the progressive, intellectual, left-wing philosophers of the mid to late 20th century. They worked at what they called deconstruction, deconstructing the stories that were told, the dominant stories, being told by the existing power elites that impacted and actually formed and upheld the structure of a culture in which they had their power. Stories of history, stories of production and labor, stories of knowledge and intelligence, stories of art, stories of race and hierarchy, stories of dominance and submission. And that was controversial, very controversial. That process of deconstruction was the target of and probably the motivating force of the conservative backlash that came out of that progressive reform. It was seen as amoral, atheistic, as destructive of the gains that had been achieved by Western civilization. That was the conservative story. As an aside, I find that really ironic then that the clearest, most extensive application of the idea of the relativity of truth has come out of what had been the conservative movement, with its alternative facts and its ever-changing story. But the response to that backlash, though, can't be to insist that the truth can only be found in objective facts that we're in charge of, that we know, and so we're right. Because, as I've said, and I hope is clear, the facts can't be detached from the stories they come in. If we try to do that, to win our point, if we pretend that everyone else is making stuff up and we don't have a story, we only have facts, we make ourselves vulnerable to someone else's story. That's what happened in Germany in the 20th century. It's what is happening now, in a way, in the 21st century. It's what happened in Rome at the time of Jesus. And it's partly what got him killed. We have no factual evidence of Jesus. But we do have a story. And the story is true. In the scripture we've been given, if it's read deeply and wisely, in the tradition passed on, if it's handled with care, in the faith we experience that gives meaning to our lives, that story is changing. It's changed in the past. It's in a transition. And with our faith in transition, this church in transition, we're searching for a story that makes sense of it all. In reality, the way it is. Our former story wasn't false. And ours isn't really the only story. But we need to find a story that makes sense of things the way we experience it for now, and for the way that it might be experienced for the next 100 years or so. That's our calling. We're called to discern and to write a new draft, to edit, to translate, to hold on to the essence, but express it in ways we can integrate with life, with the facts as we know them and the people we know, connecting with the context of our own true lived experience. If we reject that calling, taking only what's been handed down to us, only in the way that we learned it in Sunday school, only the way it's been practiced for centuries, clinging to the past, rejecting any change, will only have two options: to be islands of irrelevance or vanish altogether. There really is no choice but to take that leap of faith. So tell the new story. Sing the new song. Be the new story. Be a new song. Be the new church, as our bishop has put it. It's Advent. A new beginning. Thanks be to God.